Voice of Truth, the official radio station of the Church of Christ or Iglesia ni Cristo.
The power
Conversation.
it could change your whole life.
INCRadio Chatline. Conversations that matter.
Hello, everyone who's tuning into INC Radio Chatline, where we have conversations that matter. And today's conversation that we'll be talking about is ego. We'll be talking about ego today. Not something that we hear very often, but luckily I'm not by myself. I have someone to kind of hash this out with me, to kind of talk this through with me. It's Arnie all the way over there. She's back in Fort Worth, Texas, correct?
Yes, Fort Worth here, and they're doing ice treatment on our roads because supposedly we're supposed to get snow, but we'll see.
Oh, in Texas. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's not often, but we get what we call the snowmageddon, which happens like once a year
Oh, true.
for a day or two.
Well, stay safe there. As long as I have you now in this moment, we'll talk together about our topic. And then for those who are tuning in with us, feel free to leave your comments there. We do want to hear what your thoughts are about this. It's something that comes up in conversation, I feel sometimes, or maybe we kind of observe it about certain people at times when we hear the word ego. I feel like it has a negative connotation. How do you understand ego, Arnie? Like how would you describe it?
For me, I don't know if it's always negative. For me, it's more of your self-esteem. And so it's how you see yourself. And so if you think you're way better than everybody else, then yes, I see the negative there. But to have your self-confidence and self-esteem, I don't necessarily think ego is bad. So I think it just depends on how how you portray yourself, but then how you treat others when it comes to the ego. You know what I mean?
Yes. That's so I'm glad that you kind of hit it on the nail like right off the bat because you know as I've always heard it, it always comes up negatively in conversation. But I did have this conversation with some of my friends the other day when we were at the gym, and I was asking them, I was like, and they were kind of taken off guard. They were just like, "What?" And I was like, "Yeah, like, what do you think about someone who has an ego? Is it always a bad thing? Can it be a good thing?" And it made me think of like different characters that I've fallen in love with, like not literally, but different characters from like movies, like superhero movies, where they have two sides to them, where they have a big ego, but then there's like other redeemable qualities about them that kind of make them this complex character. So I kind of think of it as that way. There's one particular in mind that shares my name. if you can kind of guess, Tony. Yeah, got it.
Iron Man?
Yeah. Because you're gonna get, yeah, it's kind of like that. But my question to you, Arnie, because you already like touched on it being more of a neutral thing, just depending on the situation, right? How have you seen like someone's ego kind of manifest? Like if you were to observe someone, you were like, oh, that's like ego. What are your thoughts
I've
on
seen it, not necessarily with my friends, but with people that I know, where they're just insisting they're always right
that? Okay.
when they're not. And
Yeah.
for me, okay, if you're always right, that's good. But if you're wrong, but you keep insisting you're right, I think that's the bad part of ego, you know?
Not being able to be corrected, right? Not being able to take that criticism or be like, hey, like you you think you were right, but no, not not anymore, not in this situation.
Exactly. But then I also see another way where somebody is so confident where and I'm gonna admit I've done this before where I know I'm wrong, but I I have a way of being able to convince other people that I'm right, and then they'll give in. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And I don't tell them, no, I'm actually wrong, but you know, and I think that's how sometimes people's ego gets to it because nobody ever wants to be wrong. And I think that's where ego plays a part. And so that just um yeah, it just makes it weird.
I can kind of see it too in situations where I'm laughing at what Ren's put in in the chat. He said we all have that one friend, that one friend in our circle where it makes me, because another aspect to ego aside from the whole being right is people who are really well skilled in something, right?
Mhm.
Like they're really well skilled in some kind of let's say for sports. I feel like I've had moments myself where I'm not super great at basketball, but for whatever reason, when I'm playing basketball, I feel like I get this ego where I, I'm like I try to how like you try to intimidate the other player to kind
Yeah.
of like psych them out. I feel like that kind of builds in me, and then I get overconfident, and then I mess up, and I'm like, oh man, I shouldn't have overshot it. So it's like it's stuff like that where people, but there are people who are actually really, really good at stuff. Like let's say they're really, really smart in math and they have like an ego about it because they know they can back it up, like that
Yeah.
kind of thing as well.
And see, and like Ren said, there's always a confrontation, which is so true because when people's ego comes out, it's like they want to prove everybody wrong. I mean,
Mm.
there are some people who have high self-esteem, yet they don't let the ego get the best of them, wherein they're not going to put people down to make themselves look good. But there are people who are very vocal and like, no, 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 I know this, I'm right, you're wrong, and verbalize that on a regular basis.
So you think someone could have an ego, but like it's more self esteem because they're not trying to prove anything to anyone, right? In that sense, that's what I'm getting from what you said, Ernie.
Yes, yes. Because I mean, like, if we look at the word, I don't know what the definition is, but I do remember seeing like synonyms as like self esteem, confidence, and
Hmm.
all that stuff, which is not bad to have. But I
Yeah.
think when you try to enforce or you try to put people down because you think you know better, I think that's where the negative part of ego plays a part.
When I was looking up, because I was kind of comparing different words, like what you mentioned, ego with confidence or ego with pride. The one distinguishing characteristic between confidence, like what you mentioned, like that self esteem of a realistic belief in one's abilities, whereas ego is kind of like inflated sense of self importance that stems from, this is from the internet, that stems from insecurity. So there can be something that like like that phrasing of, oh, that was a blow to his ego, or that was like it kind of, you have moments where you're like, oh, that made me feel insecure, and where I feel like with self-esteem, it's not something that's so easily, I guess, swayed or so easily shaken, where as ego could be in that sense.
Yeah, and I agree because a lot of times when people lack that self-confidence or when then they think that they have to look better than others even
Hmm.
though they're not. And I think that that plays a role because I have seen people who are confident and who are capable and yet they don't have that big ego that they have to flash everything.
Gotcha.
It's just like the rich. If you notice, like a lot of the rich people, they're not out there flaunting their Ferraris or Maseratis or anything like that. Sometimes they have humble cars or humble homes. But it's those people who are not really wealthy, who likes to flaunt all that just to make it look like they're among the
There's
wealthy.
something, yeah.
Yeah,
Like they got
that's
something
how it's.
to prove, like what you mentioned earlier. It's like that image, kind of like protecting that image. I feel
Hmm.
like in that same sense of what you were saying earlier, like, oh no, I'm right.
Hmm.
No, I'm right. And in like whatever situation may be. So that begs the question now for me: how does it affect like our day to day life with thinking of how an ego can manifest or how it can show up? How does it affect day to day life? You kind of touched on it a little bit, like whether it's in relationships. I feel like that's a big one. Like I feel like ego can affect relationships a lot.
Yeah, and I not only relationships, but also let's say how things are, whether you go to work or you go to school. Because I do remember, when I was in school, I was like in honor classes and everything. So everybody there was smart, but nobody had that ego where, um, they were thinking that they were better than others. And then all of a sudden, this one person decides to come into our class and thinks he's above everybody else. And nobody wanted to be friends with him, you know? And I think it ruins relationships because you don't want to be around people who make you feel bad. And so when somebody's so egotistical that they make everybody feel bad, that's not something that I would want to be around. I want to actually be around people who are more positive, and I don't care, whether you have an ego or not, just be more positive. And so when you have that negative connotation, it's like, what, who wants to be friends with them?
It changes the environment for sure. I can think of that. You kind of mentioned like academic, but even in the work environment too, right? There's always that one person that, oh, if you get paired with them to work together, you're like,
Yes. And
just
like right now in my current job, so like I'm a corporate instructor, and so I was able to work in the field, so I know what I'm doing when I'm training, right? But then they decided to hire somebody who's got a really, high degree. He's got his PhD, but he knows nothing about airport operations, but he thinks he's better than everybody else because he's got a PhD. But I'm like, okay, you can have a PhD, but you don't know how to train these people because you don't know the job. But his ego is like so big. Like, we try to welcome them and everything, but then now it's come to the point where nobody wants to be around them because that's all they talk about, how great they are or how great of a degree they have or what they've accomplished. But yet, when it's time to do the actual job, they can't do it.
I'm glad that you said that, Arnie, because it reminds me of a conversation um that I had a while ago with my mom when we were talking about, like going up I guess you can say going up the corporate ladder, right? Like, but
Mhm.
in her sense, the example was like, because she's in the hospitality, or I don't
Mhm.
know, like she works for a hotel, and she started off
Oh,
as a housekeeper, right? And then as the years go by, you can kind of go up the ladder and you get into these positions of like being a manager, right, or some kind of supervisor. And when you're in that position, you kind of it changes the way that you, I guess, interact with others, right? And for some people, not everyone, it can bring that sense of, oh, like I'm better than you because I'm a supervisor now. And sometimes there's like a disconnect between them and where they used to be before as, like, let's say a housekeeper. They kind of forget, what that job was like being down there, and they there's that disconnect of, like what you were saying earlier, thinking that you're better than them now that you're in that position. But both of those positions are arguably important, right? And I feel like the same is true, like in that example that you mentioned, where people who have like PhDs, again, not generalizing, but because they've attained this certain level, they think they'll be good at everything. But then it's like, well, you're not an expert in this field, so you can't really say that you're going to know every single thing. But they just have that air to them that, like, oh yeah, yeah, they're trying to speak knowledgeably about it, but you can tell that it's not really there. We're not
yeah.
experts also, by the way, just we're
and
just
and
having conversation.
and sometimes we gotta put him in their place, and like I said, for the first few weeks he just kept thinking he was the greatest. And then when he started to realize, when students would ask him questions and he couldn't answer because he didn't know the job, and I'm like, see, the students are now putting him in his place because it's now he can't answer questions, he has to look to us to answer those questions. And so, when you're in that type of position, I would hope that you would know your place and not think that you're better than others until you've gained that experience, like you, like you said, your mom, she's in hospitality, right? So if that was a topic we were talking about and she knew every single thing, oh, I'd be okay with her being that way because she knows it. But if she's never worked there, but then now all of a sudden she thinks she's like the greatest person because she's a manager, and I'm like, yeah, no.
It's I feel like it's always tough in situations like that because I see Ren's put there in the live chat. He's like, you just kind of look down at the floor when they're listing down their greatness. Because trying to confront something like that is difficult, right? Especially if you feel like you're not in the position to really call out somebody. I don't know if you feel comfortable calling out people, like when you
Oh,
have
I
moments
do.
like
You
that.
know
Do
I
you?
do. No,
How do you do that?
and that's another thing because sometimes even though I could call people out on it, depending on how they are, a lot of times I don't because sometimes they can't be rational. So it doesn't
Mm,
matter even if you want them to see the light. Sometimes they won't see the light because they're so full of themselves that no, it doesn't matter what people say. I know everything.
yeah, it's like kind of picking your battles, right?
It
Trying to
is.
pick your battles in moments like that with people.
Yeah. And sometimes and I'm not going to say this general either, but I do know when I was younger, I had a bigger ego than what I have now, right? I mean, now I realized, okay, it doesn't really matter, how you are. It's just, do people like you?
I also noticed too, it's hardest with personal relationships when it comes to ego because one of the things that I've experienced is because I feel like in the situations that you brought up, it's easier to kind of like walk away from that stuff, or it's easier to like let that stuff go. Whereas like let's say you get in a disagreement with like your friend, or if you're in a relationship with like with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and then you have that kind of stalemate of who's gonna say sorry first. I feel like that's another thing. It's just like, well, I was right. Like you're telling yourself like in your head, and that's why you don't obviously, what we practice is a lot different, right? We always try to our best to go to the person when we felt we were hurt. But we
Yeah,
do have
and
those moments.
and like that, I'm going to tell you now, it has happened in relationships, and this is why I strongly believe in the whole opposites attract kind of a thing, because when you've got two headstrong people in a relationship, they're always going at it, and people tend to not give in because that's the ego playing. Even I'm not going to give in, why should I? And that other person's not going to give in either, right? And so that's why I believe in this whole people should be different, because when they are too much alike, it gets very confrontational, and it does take a bigger person to give in or compromise, but it can't always be the same person compromising, because then that doesn't work either.
I feel that. Too similar, yeah. That can be that can be troublesome sometimes. Not giving relationship advice. So again, we're not experts, but that's just one way that I've also experienced ego. Just personally, it's hard sometimes, especially in the middle of that moment where you're kind of going back and forth, and then also when you realize, at least to myself, I realized like, oh, I think I misunderstood what they said, but you're still in the middle of like disagreement, and then like you're like later, like much later on, you're like, by the way, I had a moment of realization where I realized I was wrong. I'm sorry. I
And
misunderstood what you said.
and like Ren said, where he's like, you have that one friend, right? It's true. You have a group of people. There's always going to be that one person who thinks they're above everybody else. But I think you get to the point in your friendship where, okay, well, we know Tony's going to be the headstrong one, and we're going to accept it, right? We're not going to try to be confrontational with her because we know she's always right, right? So, and like
Stubborn.
I said, everyone's always got that one person in the group. And I mean, I have that with my friends and my sisters, but I don't feed into it, one. But two, I'm not going to, I already know they're going to fight you on everything. So I'm not even going to start it. You know what I mean? So you learn to agree to disagree. But then I always just say, they're going to be who they are. It doesn't matter what we do. So I just let it go. But it's true. You have someone in your group who's like that, whether it's a sibling or a friend or, you know, an ex. And that's why they're an ex.
Ouch. But I mean, it's yeah. There are moments like that where it's hard to kind of reconcile in that moment. But I feel like at the end of the day, you find ways to work it out, even though your ego may be bruised for that moment, for whatever it is,
Yeah.
when it
But
counts.
the hardest part, though, when it comes to friendships or relationships, is sometimes where people don't know how to reel in their ego. And
Hmm.
sometimes it does hurt relationships where people just don't want to be around you. And they, because I have seen people who lost friendships over that. And, so I always try to ask, what's more important? Is being right more important, or
Hmm.
is it having these relationships? Because if you think being right is more important, then yeah, you're going to lose all your relationships unless you're going to be with somebody who likes the person with the big ego. And I think that's where we have to think, what's more important? Is it more important to be right, which some people think it is, or is it more important to keep your friends and then decide what you're going to do from there?
Yeah, weigh the pros and cons. No, that's so true. Just because I think of, I had a conversation about this recently with one of my friends. We were talking about, even like with families. I think, because I feel like the closer that you are to a person, the more intense, like, some disagreements can be sometimes. And when you have those moments, especially when you're very familiar with each other and you know each other's like tendencies and weaknesses, that make that, I feel like that elevates it, like even more so. But what's nice about it, though, in those situations, when you have, the right kind of people around you, you can tell yourself, like, yeah, I'm willing to let go of this, and to not let it carry onwards, and just kind of like hold on to it. um Being able to let go, and not and not, I guess, hold it over each other, in that way. Not, I don't want to say that it's just a grudge, but, like what you said, Arnie, it's like, I'm thinking of different people where, it if they hadn't like let go of that thing, we
Yeah.
wouldn't be friends anymore, I feel
And
like.
and Renz did put in a comment with something about, if you have a grievance at a restaurant or something, then that's usually the time where we would take advantage of the person with a big ego, because, then they can fight for whatever bad thing has happened and they're not going to let it go. So sometimes they're useful to have that ego.
Yeah, I more people came to mind as you were saying that. I don't know if Nate is one of those kinds of people. I can't tell what kind of ego that he has, but I'm glad to see him with us in the hangout. Hi, Nate.
Thought you were about to say that I was someone you think of when you think of an ego.
No, no.
Now I was listening when I was driving home. I'm here now, but one thought that came to mind was I noticed, like, when you meet someone with a really big ego, and then like you meet their parents, and you're like, oh, I see where it came from. It came from like one of their parents. Yeah.
Little
So
flex.
as like a parent, like, you have to be conscious of that, and I think maybe uh if you have a big ego, maybe you don't have that self-awareness. And sometimes I feel like I'm a little hyper aware, like I get worried that I'm talking too much, so I tend to cut off my talking prematurely sometimes. But when we like teach our children, and they see our behaviors when other people don't see us, because like I realize that, like, when me and my wife are talking, you know um that's kind of when our son is picking up on things and he's learning things. So it reveals a lot about the parents when you know the behaviors of the children.
I have to agree with what Nate says. And so, my nephews all grew up in the States, so they can only speak English. And so my sisters and I will speak in another language just so that my nephews don't understand what we're saying, because it's true. Like one time, my sisters and I were talking about something. My nephews were playing stuff, and I did not think they were paying attention. All of a sudden, my nephew comes up to me and goes, Auntie, is this true? I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, I heard you guys talking, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to be more careful now. And so, now we'll speak in other languages, and we have this made up language that my sisters and I speak so that my nephews can't understand us. Because it's true though, Nate, like what you said, they pick up on how you are or how you act, and that's something they pick up on. And so when they do see, people around them who's got a big ego, that may manifest in them. So
Yeah, and just to bounce off of that, like even your thoughts on people. And this was something I learned as a teacher. Like, you may think like, all right, this kid's, he's a little piece of garbage. I was like, I need to not think that, because that is going to manifest itself in like how you treat people. And what I learned about teenagers is like they can tell when you're not being sincere. So even if somebody has like an ego, but they aren't being truthful, you can read into that, and you know when someone is like being fake, and that kind of leads into that too. So it's like, are you, it comes down to like how genuine of a person are you, and how self-aware are you as a person? Are you aware of like your own faults, or like how, the conversation is going? Are you just completely unaware, and you're just living in your own, little fantasy world that you're the greatest person ever? You're the main character. I've heard of that recently, main character syndrome. Have y'all
Main
heard of
character
that?
energy.
Yeah.
This is actually something that came up when I was talking about it with my friends the other day. Do you think that someone can have an ego but not be aware of it? Do you think it's more common that people just aren't aware that oh yeah, you have an ego and they just need it pointed out to them? Or do you think most people are aware and that's just how they?
like I said, like what Nate was saying, like if that's how their parents are, right, and that's where they picked it up from, then I don't think that they see that they have an ego, because to them that's the norm. And I think it's only those people who don't have an ego, where it's not the norm for them, and that's how they can see that that person has an ego. But I mean, there are some people who are aware they do have that ego, and they don't care. But there are some people who are so naive where they really just think they're better than everybody else.
I think like when social media was kind of, gaining popularity, like that really brought out a lot of egos in people, because like you can show off. I feel like that's dying down now though, because you could be scammed if you put too much of your info out on the internet. Also, people can be called out, if they're, not living up to whatever image they're posting. I mean, I find though that maybe there's been more of a swing back to where people aren't being as egotistical. I mean, you're more likely to notice people being egotistical, so maybe that just stands out in your brain more. Just kind of like how the human mind works. We're more likely to um, notice things that are, more, that would pose more of a threat. But if you really, really think about it, like you just take any group of people, like the majority of them are pretty, quiet, and they don't put themselves out there.
I feel like another way that it's affected me personally, in my ability to learn things. I feel like can get in the way of that. Um, I'll give a good example is like trying a new sport. I feel like that self consciousness of, am I gonna look dumb? Am I gonna look weird while I'm doing this? And then that that feeling of, oh, how are people going to perceive me in that way? Like it kind of plays into that as well. Like your ability to learn. It reminds me of what Arnie was saying earlier with the whole PhD guy or girl, gal, I don't know, what was it?
Guy.
It was a guy. That idea of, you want to look like you know everything, or you want to look like you can do everything perfectly. I feel like that's also how ego has kind of affected me. And I like what you mentioned too, Nate, about social media. I feel like in the beginning when it was starting out, it was uh, it's something that can have the potential, but not as much anymore. I think just because people keep receipts as they as they say. People keep receipts now, so people can call you out a lot more harshly. I feel like too because of social media. But I don't know.
Yeah, it is a thing now, like to, bring people down, who kind of build themselves up. I mean, on the flip side, like if you're so, uh, I don't know what the exact opposite word for ego is. I was thinking of like humility, but I don't think that necessarily is the direct opposite. But where people, if they swing back into the direction where they don't have self confidence or they don't want to put themselves out there, like I don't think that's good either. I think people should have some self confidence somewhere in the middle. I don't know what your thoughts on that, on like the opposite, like people going to the opposite end of the spectrum.
I think that you can have because I believe it was Arnie who mentioned it earlier. There are people who, in the sense of ego, of self esteem, like they have good self esteem. Like you have to be able to be have some sense of confidence to do things well, right? Because if you don't do things, if you're constantly doing things with like a fright or hesitation or reluctance, like I think about like driving. If you didn't have a certain sense of confidence in driving, I feel like you could cause a lot of accidents. Like I feel that all the time when I realize like, oh, I should have just went straight because I could have just caused an accident just now by hesitating. So that's one example that I can think of where, you know, um, that sense of self-esteem or self-confidence comes into play. The opposite word that I'm thinking of is not necessarily humility, but modestness, because that feels like having it more balanced out. Because what Arnie was saying earlier, I don't know if you caught it, Nate. It's like you have that awareness of what you're capable of, but you're not necessarily verbalizing it every 5 minutes. Or like telling everybody like this is what I am and I can do all these things. The list, right? I think it was Renz who was mentioning the list earlier, like people just like listing down, things that are great about them. I don't
What
know.
I thought of a better example actually, from what y'all discussed earlier, like when people just always like to say that they're right and they insist on that they are right and that things should go their way. The opposite of that would be where they just give in every single time. Like they don't argue. They're just like, as soon as you say, "Hey, this is wrong," they're just like, "Okay," and they just go along with it. And I know like in a professional setting, like at my company, they don't want that at all. They want people to have healthy debates. So everyone has to kind of come at the table, set the egos aside, but you also have to come in, willing to stand your ground and state your case at least and talk things out. And I know like recently I was having an argument with someone over, a process of something. We just kept going back and forth about it. Ultimately I knew my place. I was like, well, I'm not an expert in this. I just wanted to give my thoughts. And I went ahead and yielded. So I was like, okay, we'll go with what you guys are suggesting. And I think that's how it should be. It should be to where things can be talked through, egos can be set aside, but at the same time, people don't just give in and just agree with everything.
That's a great example, Nate. I didn't even think about that. Arnie, go ahead. I saw you about to
No,
finish your
I
statement.
agree because I mean, you have to know your place. I mean, there are times where yes, we need the expert matter people and we need to know, have guidance and everything. But then I think there should also be a point where Nate said you can't give in to everything. If you know that person is wrong, why would you give in just because their ego is inflated? You know what I mean? So I think it's just having that balance. And there was something that Christopher had typed in where he says ego plays a larger part in the bullying problems kid experience online and at school. And like you were saying earlier, the people who have these egos, it's because they're lacking in something. And so it's true, like, people have to make other people look bad to make themselves look good. So that's I think that's a difference between having an ego and having self-confidence.
Hmm. It feels like power plays, right? Like that exercise of power. I feel like comes into play with ego. That sense of inflated, like inflated importance, right? Feeling that you have a sense of self importance that oh, I'm superior to you. Whereas in a Christian mindset, we're always like service, right? Service and humility. But I do like what you guys mentioned too, that being able it has to be a balance of not always just giving in for the sake of of giving in, like, oh, I'm just gonna, being able to, because we have principles also, and and if you were just to just give in all the time, what would happen to your principles, what would happen to things that are important to you, then it would just kind of end up at the wayside. And you're like, well.
And that kind of
And
reminds me of
like
like
they said,
management. Oh,
you got to pick your battles,
Yeah.
you got to figure out, is it worth it? Is it worth it to get into confrontation with this person when you know they're not going to give in, when you know they're always right? Or, because depending on what you're talking about or what you're dealing with. If it's like a matter of life and death, then yes, stand up, say something. But if it's something that's not even as important, I just like, okay, think what you want. It's okay. I know I'm right anyways, and I know you're wrong, but hey.
and I was gonna say, like, I was thinking of like management. So I held like a manager role when I was teaching, and I learned my lesson from somebody else who was managing us, and they were terrible. They were a micromanager. They insisted like everything be done their way, and it was so dysfunctional, and things weren't getting done right, and things weren't working because it's like, all right, you're so overconfident, but you're clearly bombing in the classroom whenever we're doing things your way. And I learned from that lesson, and when I became a manager myself, I realized like, okay, we have some newer teachers coming in. They don't have experience. I'm looking out for them, and I'm managing their failure. Okay, not just advising how they can succeed, but managing their failure. So what that looks like is, all right, if I gave them an assignment and it's not the greatest thing ever, someone who's kind of egotistical would just like override everything they did. And I said, no, I'm gonna let them, go ahead and deliver this lesson in the classroom. It's theirs, and they'll learn from it. It's a very minor thing. It's just a 1 day thing. It's just a small lesson. So this would be greater as like a learning opportunity. Other times you do have to step in to make sure people don't make massive failures. But when you become like a leader of a group, you have to be mindful that you need to be invested in those that are working underneath you. And as much as some of us want to do everything ourselves, and that's something I had to learn, it's much better if you can get others invested in the projects and give their input, and then you can help them grow. So that was something I learned as a manager, and I'm seeing it a lot more often, like in the corporate space. Like, I guess managers are being better trained in, not being micromanagers, not trying to, you know, do everything for the employees, but really investing in their growth, even if it means like at first they're not going to be the greatest.
I love that you mentioned that, Nate, and knowing that both you and Arnie have worked in some kind of corporate level, I want to stay on this part a little bit more, because um, leadership in general can be so crucial to, like what you were just mentioning, the growth of an organization of different people. How would you say, like from your experiences, um, would be a way for someone to kind of manage their ego when they've reached a certain position, like not letting it get to their head, or trying to just manage it, if not totally remove the ego.
I think it's really important that they don't have egos when they are in management, because I've had many, different bosses. And I just remember the one whose ego was so big, they were just not fun to work with or work for, compared to the ones like Nate was saying, the one trying to grow the team and have that understanding, compassion. So I think as leaders, we got to have our egos in check, because nobody wants to work with you, you know. Um, how they're going to do that, I don't know. I just know they're no fun to work with.
I mean, I feel like I had to learn the hard way, just you try to do everything yourself. I mean, you learn this like in high school when you have like group projects, and this is kind of where like everyone kind of gets a taste of how it works. I mean, ultimately a lot of group projects just turn into like the smartest kid wanting to make sure they get an A, and they end up doing everything. And I know that was me.
I was like that.
So just learning like, when you're staying up late till like 2 in the morning because you're trying to get everything done, you're like, this, I don't like doing this. um and you just know that just by manpower alone, when you think about the economics of everything, and it's something you do have to think about. You have to think about, like, you know, you have to have that mindset where you're not always going to be doing everything correctly. You got to be open minded enough to, you know, uh, accept that you could do things better. That there's always going to be a better way of doing things. So it's, there's that reflection that comes into play. So perhaps people who have egos don't do any reflection. They just like, well, I did it.
Mm.
I did my job. I'm moving on. Or everyone else was wrong. I don't need to think twice about that. So I think, when you can teach that, and I know I was taught that when we were training to be teachers, um, that we should have, part of the time in our training for self-reflection. So that's something a good manager should also implement. It's like, hey, reflect on, we're starting a new year. Reflect on the prior year. Like, what worked, what didn't. What do you want to change?
So Christopher had put something in the chat which I thought was very interesting, and he said, as a leader or manager, if you have the mindset that you can learn from your subordinates, it helps keep your ego in check. And I think that is so true, because you know and I've seen it where there are people who come into the management position, and they think that they have to prove something, so the ego gets the best of them. But then they start to realize nobody wants to work with them. But like with what Christopher said, where, even if you're a manager, but you have that mindset where you could still learn from others, I think they get more respect than those who try to, force their stuff on their employees. So I liked what he said.
Yeah, that is a great insight, because I feel like, just going back to the things that you were mentioning before, Nate and Arnie, with leaders that I appreciate are always the ones that set people to, or even just me, like personally, what I would always want from the people that would take my place in certain positions. Like, I want them to do better than I did, right? Like, I want them to be able to be better than I was. I don't know why Arnie's laughing. I don't know if that sounds insincere or not, but
Yeah, I'm just laughing because, you know, I that's why I said sometimes I do have an ego, because I want to feel like I'm irreplaceable, right? So sometimes when I have to train somebody, and I'm like, I'm not going to teach them all the tricks, because one, I had to learn it the hard way, but two, I need them to need me, so I'm not going to teach them everything.
okay. Arnie's or circling in different things. Nate's just processing. He's just like,
I
okay,
think I'll allow it because the corporate world, you do kind of have to look out for yourself because
true.
they could just lay
You
you
do.
off.
Because
So
if you're replaceable, they will replace you, right? But if there's a way where you can do, like, for instance, my previous job, I was doing marketing for commercial real estate, and our brokers would go on trips, and they would take their clients on trips, and they said, Arnie, what do we need to do when we get there? And if I tell them, oh, nothing, everything's good, then they're going to go and have fun. But when I say, oh, I still need to do this and this and this and this, then they're like, well, come along with us, because, they need me to do all those things. So then guess what? I get a free trip.
Interesting. No comment there. That's just the Arnie style. No, but I also like what Melanie put there in the comment section. She said it's important to have a sense of self-worth and exude confidence, but an inflated ego can come off as arrogant or entitled. And who wants to be around people like that? So I feel like internally you could probably view yourself a certain way, but keeping yourself in check. The two buzzwords that are coming up for me are self-awareness and open-mindedness. The ability to kind of look at yourself and see where you are at. Like, you could see yourself like, yeah, I feel good about this thing. I feel confident, but I think I can still learn more, or I still have the ability to learn more from other people who could be younger or even less experienced from me in the field. Again, going back to that PhD guy that you mentioned earlier, Arnie. But I do want to ask the both of you, have you learned anything from observing your personal egos? And is there any misconception about ego that you would want to address?
So for me, what I learned was, you know, it doesn't matter if you're wrong or you're right. Okay. And usually it's you're right. What's more important? Is it more important to be right? Or is it more important to have peace and harmony? So even though I know I'm right, but if I know that it's going to cause some kind of drama, I'm not going to tell everybody, well, I'm right, you're wrong, and leave it at that, because I would rather have the peace and harmony over being right. But like I said, uh, you know, you learn this as you get older. And so that's why we're hoping the young people will learn it now instead of when they get older.
And I think like older people in general, though, they, just from experience, and you'll notice this in a lot of older people, like they don't talk themselves into situations where, um, they can damage like friendships and relationships. Not as often. Now, granted, it still happens. Okay, there's still plenty of examples. Some people never learn, but those older, wiser people that we typically look up to, like they know how to navigate and know what to bring up and what not to bring up. To kind of avoid unnecessary confrontations. I was just thinking of I was hanging out with some friends, and one of my friends brings up like a controversial topic, and I could just tell like other people were just getting upset about the opinions that other people were sharing. I'm like, why did he even bring this up? Like, we're just here chilling out, and like he should have been self-aware that like you bring in a conversation like that, now some people aren't gonna like each other. And like I've learned that sometimes like your opinions, you know um should not be more valuable than your relationships with your friends. So as you get older, you'll learn like what to bring up and what not to bring up, and to like Arnie mentioned, how to keep the peace, because sometimes that is more valuable. It's like, why? And when you're talking about conversations, it's like you're just talking about things. You may be unnecessarily causing friction with the people that you love. And at the same time, like I've learned, like, okay, my friend brought that up and everyone's upset, I'm just gonna let it go. It's like,
And
fine.
some people just like to bring that up just to have a fun discussion, or they just want to see how far they could push people. You know what I mean? and
That
and, and
sounds
so
familiar.
no, seriously. And so, like I said, you got to learn to pick your battles, because it's happened, like especially when people talk about politics and stuff like that. Sometimes they just want to rile you up. And so when people start doing that, I just ignore them and not say anything, because I already know if I give my opinion, then they're going to give their opinion, then we're going to go at it, and it's just not worth it.
Yeah, so that's one thing that I reflect on. It's just, the older I get, the more I realize like you're better able to navigate, especially if you reflect and you learn from, your past mistakes. You learn how to keep the peace better, around other people. Especially if you're a leader, you have to kind of, you know, please a bunch of people with different personalities. So you have to be kind of likable in a general way. Uh, you learn that lesson pretty fast when you're a teacher and you manage teachers, because teachers are very, very opinionated. So you have to learn real quick, how to wrangle the cats, keep them from fighting. So yeah, that's the biggest thing I learned. It's just you learn how to navigate, relationships and not bring things up unnecessarily.
Is there any misconceptions that you guys want to address about ego in general? Things that you learn personally that maybe people might misunderstand, or I think Arnie, you kind of touched on it earlier, right? It's not like a black and white kind of thing. it's more of like a spectrum, and finding that balance between the self-esteem and being overly obnoxious. Like,
Yeah, and I mean that's one thing for me. I think is just how people are. It's know the difference about being self confident and then having that ego, because some people, they do have that self confidence. Sometimes they're just happy, like let's say they accomplished something and they did something, they're not doing it in a bad way, they're just proud and they're happy that they were able to accomplish that. And so I think seeing that and being positive is different than them thinking they're better than somebody else. And so sometimes I think how it's the message comes along will also determine that. But then people shouldn't just assume like, oh, Nate got a promotion and he's happy about it. He's not being egotistical about it. He just wants to share his joy, and I think just know the difference between those two.
I did get a promotion recently.
Well, congratulations. We're happy for you.
Congrats!
Well,
Yay!
it was more of a horizontal move. It was more corporate talk. But one misconception I probably want to address is, when we're judging people thinking that they're egotistical, that's like our perception of them at that moment. And it may not be the most accurate perception of someone. So I just think like, usually you need like 3 points of data to be able to start seeing a trend. And if you just catch somebody on a particular day and just things aren't going right, you may incorrectly judge someone as egotistical and write them off, And and that's just something I learned. It's like, you know, never judge not only people by like the trying to find the words like never judge a book by its cover, right? But like never judge a book maybe by like its first like 3 pages or whatever, or just a random page in the book. Really try to give people a chance, um to give a better impression of themselves, because you never know, they might just be having a bad day or an off day, or you might be completely wrong about your perception of them. And I know that's happened, and that's something that I've learned, like so yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Arnie,
Yep.
you're muted.
One thing I did learn about the whole ego thing is, it's good to learn from your mistakes in the past, or, things that happen in your past. But I think it's better to learn from other people. That way you don't have to make those mistakes. And so, if you see having this ego has burned relationships, don't make that mistake for you to learn from it. Learn from what other people already did so that you don't have to go through that. That's how I like to learn.
Any last thoughts, guys, on the topic? I'm not trying to stretch it out, but this is really. I feel like I've learned so much in it. I know it's only an hour, but it just felt like it just kept evolving, and I really enjoyed this conversation because it's something that feel like we encounter every day. But when we actually get to sit and talk and think about it, it's nice to be able to consider these different factors, especially that last thing that you said, Nate, trying not to write off somebody just because of that one instance that you saw them, that maybe they were having a moment of pride, but then you know people write them off as like, oh, he's got a big ego. They get turned off like, oh, he's got a big ego. Any
So
final
Christopher did say something which I think is really good. He goes, sometimes personalities clash. It doesn't mean
comments?
they're egotistical, and that's so true. And that's why, like I said, you got to get the whole content and figure out, like, are they really being egotistical, or maybe they just have a very strong personality. Like, I have a strong personality. I don't think I'm egotistical.
Some people are more verbal about their confidence. Yeah, more verbal about what they know that they can do. I don't know. Any final thoughts, Nate, before we close out?
I just lost my thought. I was thinking about a movie that I've often voiced that I dislike. I was like, should I give it another chance? It's like, no, I think I've watched like 3 or 4 separate movies, and it doesn't ring true for me. It doesn't work for me. But yeah, just yeah, don't write off people. And I like to think that, if somebody is not treating me well, or isn't doing so well, I'm like, I like to think like I still think there's like a redemption arc for this person, and that's something I would want to see out of this person. So I'm a lot more hopeful that even the most rotten of people will change, and I want to be able to allow that, because when that person finally does come around and they realize they've done wrong, do you want to be there to rub it in their face, or do you want to be there to be like, all right, let's move forward? And it's much better. It's like, hey, somebody's changed, let's encourage that, let's encourage good behaviors, and forgive and forget and move forward.
And also, if you are a true friend and you notice somebody's ego is getting the best of them, sometimes it's nice to let them know, so that hopefully they'll realize it, and then they won't try to push their beliefs on other people. And then that way it kind of helps them also in the long run, so that they don't lose friends. And sometimes it's hard to let someone know, hey, you're stepping over the line and you're crossing the line. But that's something I think we have to do just to keep the peace.
I don't know. I don't know anything else to add to that, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that everyone who's listening has learned something, whether it's about dealing with your own ego, dealing with other people's ego, and how to navigate that, because um, we encounter different people all the time, and it's nice to be able to kind of sit and think about these things, so we know how to move better in the world, in interacting with other people, and making sure that we're treating others with what Nate said: open-mindedness, gentleness, understanding. And if they have a big ego, then hopefully you know what to do now. So thank you to everyone who's been tuning in with us. Thank you, Nate and Arnie, for being here for our conversation that has hopefully mattered to all of you. Tune in again, same time next week, to INC Radio Chat Line, where we have conversations that matter. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Do you see my ship? Oh, hold on.
You own it? Everyone. Take care, everyone.
This is what I ask. Let me always dwell in the temple of the Lord till I breathe my last.
Looking for more conversations that matter? INC Radio Chat Line, Fridays at 8 p.m. Pacific or 11 p.m. Eastern at INC Radio DZEM 954 on YouTube.